Here's the second challenge I'm going to talk about. Hoping I've got my highlighter here. No, what I'll do is write something next to it. And he'll notice that posture teacher is not ideal. And the reason for that is that for some time in the first lesson I gave with this learner, who was a general English learner from France, I was bored, and I suddenly felt, if you like, the exposure of being in a one-to-one lesson with someone who you suddenly think you have nothing in common with. You don't have other learners to bounce ideas off. You don't have livelier people in the class to get things going. You're just alone. So the challenge was, in this case, that I was struggling to empathize with the person I was teaching. As in all the other cases I'm giving you, I'd explained the rationale behind the one-to-one lessons. I'd explained that we were going to talk, that I was going to make notes, and that those notes would form the basis of any focus on form and language study that came later. But in this case, there was no chemistry between us, and I'm sure that's something that we've all experienced in one-to-one environments. And I guess I was thinking it would have been lovely to have some materials just to have something happening in the class that I could control. However, I persevered. We persevered. He had the same surname as a famous composer, and I thought that might be interesting to talk about, so I tried that, but no, there was nothing to say about that. And I'd struggled, as we all have on occasions, to work out really why he wanted to improve his English. Anyway, we kept talking, I kept going. Essentially, I was patient. And eventually we started talking about his love of the sea and an extraordinary adventure that he'd had in a yacht whilst crossing the Bay of Biscay. And something happened while we had that part of the conversation. He realized that I was really interested in what he was talking about. I realized that he was actually a really interesting person. And from then on we bonded. And we bonded quite strongly. But he was a reticent person. He looked quite ill at ease in the school I was teaching in at the time. He was older than a lot of the learners there. And again, I think it took a long time, although it wasn't visible in his body language, for him to relax. And once that had happened, it was a breakthrough. And we met very happily and had sense quite easy one-to-one lessons after that. And he came back every year to have more. So you could say that the unplugged approach there bore fruit in repeat business. Here's the third challenge. And again, I'll take the writing tool. And you can see that I can't get a click on that. Well, I'm going to write the word mirroring here, because you've got two people, again, teacher and learner, kind of mirroring each other's body language, which is not so much tense. It's not the kind of hunched up feel of our friend here from Japan, but it was, I suppose it was a sense that neither of us quite knew what we were supposed to be doing or where we were going. Once I explained my rationale, and I'd said that we would talk and then we would look at notes that I'd made. I suppose a complication in this case was that this learner was herself a teacher from Argentina. She was part of a group of teachers who'd come to our school for a sort of refresher course that was sold. And I found myself in a one-to-one class with this lady who was leading a group of teachers, also leading a group of students, and who had been teaching English for many years. And in a sense, the feeling I got from our conversation was that her English had fossilized over the years, and that she, yes, like all of us, had spent so much time explaining certain forms in reasonably predictable contexts to young learners, that she was very reluctant, almost unable to kind of push on and use more complex forms herself. And I tried various maneuvers and various tacks, if you like, to try and get her to use that language with a little more, to give herself more of a challenge, if you like. And again, it took a long time. So I talked about being patient in the first instance when it came to the student who was so tense and whose body language was all hunched and unhappy when speaking English. And I talked about patience in the second example, where at first exposure it seemed as if there would be no chemistry between the two people in the room. And in the final example, I want to talk about persistence, because by talking, and by kind of a word that I quite like is nudging the language that we were using in our conversation towards more challenging forms, if you like, and towards areas of conversation that might generate more challenging forms, we were able finally to again make a kind of breakthrough. And by talking about her memories of the 1970s, which were a painful time in Argentina, but which she was quite happy to talk about. It wasn't a forced situation, and it wasn't a situation in which she felt uncomfortable. Suddenly, by getting into an area where there was more to talk about, where the subject matter was richer, the purpose of our being together, which was for her to refresh her English, was met. And she was able to use much more complex structures. I was able then to work with those structures and to try and get her to practice them. So the three words I've chosen here, and I'll write them down, although I'm aware from comment that you're writing below that the words I'm writing aren't necessarily visible. But in the face, empathy was called for. In the second case, patience was called for. And in the third case, a degree of persistence was called for. But that in all cases, we did achieve the scenario in which two people were sharing conversation in a natural way, and the language that was being generated by that conversation was entirely relevant to the needs of the learner, the lessons that they were taking. Adam says, the writing has appeared now. I love the internet. I'm imagining that's probably time for me to wind up.